Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted that you're joining us to hear even more evidence-led discussion about the topics that are critical to the way that we manage our water and environment. A huge thanks to our season sponsor for 2024, AtkinsRéalis, and you'll hear a little bit more about AtkinsRéalis later. If you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Niki Roach. I'm a passionate advocate for all things water and environment, and I'm a fellow of CIWEM, and that's the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. And our members in over 90 countries are professionals with a breadth and, crucially, depth of expertise in the topics that are shaping the future of our planet, and we'll be joined by many of them across this season. So in today's episode, we're exploring the topic of bioresources, sometimes called sewage sludge. And our interview is with Georgia Elliot-Smith. And Georgia's heading up a campaign to ensure environmental regulation around sewage sludge, last updated in 1989, remains effective. So whether bioresources are new to you or you're a technical expert, my co-host and I are going to help you get a better understanding of the topic, the campaign, and what the future could look like. So to help us navigate the world of bioresources, I'm delighted to be joined by the Director of Innovation and Delivery at CIWEM, Paul Shaffer. Welcome to Planet Possible, Paul.
Thanks, Niki.
So let's get started by asking a pretty key question first. What are sewage sludge and bioresources? Is it the same thing?
Bioresources, sometimes referred to as biosolids, are the end result of treating sewage sludge, really. So sewage sludge is turned into bioresources using a number of treatments that look at screening, drying, lime stabilisation and anaerobic digestion. So really the solids element of that. And within bioresources contains a number of valuable elements, including organic matter, carbon and nutrients, which can be used in agriculture. And also there's an element of energy within bioresources that can be used to be extracted for energy supply, gas and also other elements that can be extracted. On the other side, there's also some concerns about what else is within the biosolids, and there's growing interest and concern around potential environmental and public health impacts of things like microplastics, antimicrobial resistant elements and also persistent organic chemicals like PFAS. So there's lots of value in there. It's if you're thinking about circular economy and reusing our waste, there's an awful lot of value within bioresources, but there's also some potential challenges and risks that need to be managed through that process.
That's a really important point to make around challenge. And don't take this the wrong way, Paul, but this has been a very tricky episode to make. And I think you are the sixth guest that I've invited to come on and talk about this topic. So why is it so tricky to talk about bioresources at the moment?
It's a fascinating but really complex subject. So I've only been exposed to the world of bioresources for the last year in terms of a project that we're managing at CIWEM. Since 1990 or so, application of biosolids to agriculture has been regarded by the government as the best practicable environmental option. And as a result, the industry is quite locked into the process that they're currently doing. To change and pivot so markedly could be a challenge for the industry. So obviously they have their AMP business cycles, and they also need to ensure that they've got the evidence to base changes in investment procedure. So if they are trying to do something, it will take them a long time to potentially respond to any changes in regulation. So it's a period of uncertainty for the water industry in terms of waiting to see what happens with the regulations, and then they need to see and understand how they can respond. And also they're waiting for their draft and final determinations this year. So there's the 5-year cycle of investment for the water industry. And if they are thinking about other infrastructure, there's planning considerations that might be taken. And also they have upwards of 30 years of locked into technology to apply bioresources to agriculture land.
Yeah, there's a lot there, isn't there? And we're going to get into a little bit more of the detail about, well, how are they actually managed at the moment in a minute. But let's start off by hearing from our interview guest. In today's episode, we're joined by Georgia Elliot-Smith. And Georgia is an environmental engineer with over 25 years experience in the property and construction sector. She's the founder and managing director of sustainability consultancy Element 4. She's a chartered environmentalist, a member of the Institute of Environmental Management of Assessment, and a former UNESCO Special Junior Envoy for Youth and the Environment. So let's hear from Georgia.
So Fighting Dirty is a campaign and legal activism group. And really the history of it comes from the fact that in 2021, I started a legal action against the government over waste incineration and the carbon emissions from incineration that were not being properly accounted for and that were left out of the UK emissions trading scheme. I took the government to the High Court. We lost in the High Court, but then we went to appeal, and ultimately led to a change in the law. So now waste incineration has been included in the UK emissions trading scheme, and as of 2026 they have to start reporting on carbon emissions, and in 2028 they've got to start paying for participating in the scheme, so basically buying carbon credits. That all came about as a result of taking legal action, and I had been campaigning for many years against the problems with waste incineration and got basically nowhere. You know, there was a waste incinerator nearby my home. There's a huge amount that's wrong with this scheme. It's the Edmonton incinerator in North London. We'd been campaigning as groups vociferously as a community, and all we had got was knockbacks, platitudes, we'd been ignored and so on. What happened when I took legal action was so different. The government had to show up. They had to make disclosures. They had to do all of these things that you just don't get as a campaigner. And so from that, I became so buoyed up, you know, and you don't often get that as a campaigner, you know, this kind of victory feeling. But I really felt like this is the essence of change is right here. And so in 2023, you know, I've been talking to my legal team about pursuing some new actions. But one of the big things that I had found when I'd done the legal action on my own was that the crowdfunding, so I'm not a wealthy person, I don't have the money to pay for legal action. And even though the costs are very much limited by pro bono work with lawyers and so on, and the Aarhus Convention, which reduces your exposure to costs as an individual, even with that, there were high costs of bringing this, and I had to do crowdfunding. It took me a year to hit my target, and that was like really intensive work. What I realised is I needed somebody with a really good profile, and I needed a group around me to really support this and to drive this forwards. And also, as being part of a group is so much more fulfilling than just trying to fight these things on your own. And so I founded Fighting Dirty and managed to get George Monbiot along to, you know, and he's a really passionate campaigner. I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with his work. If they're not, please follow him. I mean, he's just wonderful. And then a fabulous guy called Steve Hind, who works at City to Sea, which is a plastic pollution charity, and also is a Green councillor in Stroud. And so the three of us together have formed Fighting Dirty, and now we're committed to taking legal action specifically to fight pollution. There's a lot of legal action going on around climate change and climate impacts, which is clearly something that we're very passionate about as well. But I think there's this very big area of environmental pollution, which is not really being addressed at the same level, and desperately needs attention and the force of the law behind it, because I think, as we'll get into in this conversation, you know, there's really a lack of oversight and regulation when it comes to chemical pollution and breaching environmental limits.
So you've just started to touch on it. Let's get into that. I'm really interested. What specifically are you campaigning for?
As a group, we are working on a number of different legal actions, of which one, which is our current one, which actually hot off the press, last week we received permission from the courts to proceed with a judicial review of the Environment Agency and DEFRA's decision to remove a target date from the review of the sludge strategy. So that is a case that's now going to proceed in the High Court. We are the claimants, Fighting Dirty, and the defendants are the Environment Agency and DEFRA and the Secretary of State for the Environment. That case is focused on sewage sludge and the fact that sewage sludge, the regulations haven't been updated since 1989. The profile of toxins in sewage sludge has changed dramatically over those decades, and yet the testing regime has not, and the permitting regime has not changed at all. Now, specifically, our legal challenge is about the fact that the government knows full well about these. You know, they've had expert reports completed and they know what action needs to be taken. They released a statement some years ago saying that the strategy would be updated by 2023. Middle of 2023, we wrote to the Environment Agency and DEFRA to say what's going on, there's been no action. And their response was simply to update the strategy and remove that target date for action of 2023. And what we say, our legal case, is that in removing that target date for action, they have acted irresponsibly, they've acted illegally, that they are reverting to a do-nothing position, which is what they had previously stated was unacceptable. And therefore, they've acted irresponsibly in doing that, and we want the judiciary to force them into action.
And you've started to touch on it, but I guess I'm interested in why this specifically is so important. Obviously, the legal case is around a date being removed. But if we zoom out a little bit and thinking about what your campaign is driving towards, why bioresources? Why this particular topic? Why is this so important to you?
I'm an engineer by background. I don't have a legal training at all. And this has been, over the last few years, a real roller coaster journey for me on learning about how the law works and learning about the way in which regulation and policy is developed and the way that the law can be used in order to shape those policies and that regulation. Now, obviously, I learned about this at university as an environment manager and as a sustainability director. I've given countless training courses on environmental policy and regulation and courts and taught, and all of these things that we know about. I've taught boards of directors, about the fact that regulators are going to come down on you like a ton of bricks and then as all environmental professionals will know, they don't. And you're left, going, oh, we're going to get prosecuted, and then pollution incidents happen and you're not prosecuted and everybody just stops listening to you in the end. I have 25 years experience as an environmental professional in industry, which is kind of what led me to legal action in the first place, because I know the system is not working. It simply isn't working. And actually, as an environmental professional, we have sort of two tools in our tool belt. One is the court of public opinion and whether or not you're given that social license to operate, whether consumers like you, your brand is a green and clean one, and we kind of use that as one of our tools to effect change. And the other is regulation. And it's saying, that you must do this because it's the law, or you must do this because it's part of your permitted limits and so on. And really the only thing that backs that up is having the heavy hand of enforcement coming down and demonstrating that somebody's watching, and actually that this is going to create a cause and effect, that actually if we cause pollution, if we act in a polluting way, there will be a harm caused to our business. But we know as environmental professionals that mechanism is broken. It simply isn't working. There is not sufficient regulation. What's there is confusing, it's contradictory, it's out of date. I think it's useful to have that context about, as an environmental professional, getting really disillusioned with the policy frameworks that we have available and the way in which that is implemented and properly regulated. Now, coming to fighting dirty and my experiences of changing the law around waste incineration, what that showed me was that we talk a lot about the carrot and the stick, and everybody wants the carrot and nobody wants the stick. But I've learned that actually in the corporate environment, it is the stick that works. It really is the stick that works. Insurers, risk assessors, corporate risk managers, are all looking at what we must do in order to operate. And so that's where I think law and regulation is an incredibly powerful tool. But then going into the whole mechanism of legal action, what I hadn't realised when I first started on this journey is that you don't get to challenge a policy just because it's bad. It doesn't work that way. There's a ticking clock. So from the moment when a significant event happens in the policy landscape, so there may be a response to a consultation, there may be a statement by government, that is an incident, and that incident is challengeable within a set time frame. So you only get, depending on what it is, if it's a sort of statement or a consultation response, something relatively minor like that, you get 6 weeks to respond. If it's a policy announcement, you get 12 weeks to respond. So you only get a 12-week window to take legal action. So what that means is we are always having to scan the horizon to see what's coming up that may be a relatively small piece of the jigsaw, but actually gives us a way in to challenge a much bigger problem that needs, first of all, it needs eyes on it. It needs eyes from members of the public to bring pressure to bear on government, on regulators. But also it's a way into that industry to actually have that conversation, to flag up that something is wrong, and to give civil servants that ability to bring that thing from the bottom of the filing tray to the top of the filing tray and actually act on it. Because another thing I've realised as well is that civil servants, they're not just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. There are a lot of passionate, capable, well-informed people in government who really want to change these things. And actually, as Fighting Dirty, we've had whistleblowers coming to us talking about things that they know are not happening, things that they want to see change. But they're frustrated. They're not empowered to do anything about it. And so legal action offers that opportunity for something to be brought to the top of the agenda and actually make significant progress on.
Our 2024 season of Planet Possible is supported by one of the leading engineering and design consultancies in the world, AtkinsRéalis. Here at Planet Possible, we bring a diverse range of voices from across the international water and environment sector to explore how to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face. And that aligns perfectly with the AtkinsRéalis purpose of engineering a better future for our planet and its people. We're really grateful to AtkinsRéalis for enabling us to bring another exciting year of Planet Possible to you. So specifically, we've talked about wanting to bring this action around the date change. But if we zoom out a bit from that, what does good look like? What are you hoping to achieve with the campaign more broadly around this particular topic of sewage sludge?
So if I go back to the start of really what the topic is that we're challenging, it's the fact that in 1989, the sludge agricultural use regulations were released. And that set about a regime whereby the sludge output from sewage treatment works could be used in agricultural land as a fertiliser in a process that we call land spreading. So that could just be taken and it could be used on farmland as a form of fertiliser. And on the face of it, that is a great industrial symbiosis story. You know, you're taking the waste output from one process and you're using it as a useful input to another. Undoubtedly, in human effluent, you've got great nutrient content, you know, which should be used improving land. The problem is that regime only looks at testing for a very small number of substances like heavy metals and pathogens, for example. Since 1989, the complexity of chemicals that we are using, not just in industry and, you know, what's going on with industrial trade effluent going into the sewers, but also the products that we're using in our homes. You know, for example, I can go to a sports shop and I can buy a big bottle of waterproofing liquid, which is basically PFAS, and I can stick that in my washing machine to waterproof my sports gear. You know, that didn't exist back in the day when these regulations were created. You know, since COVID, we've got a huge diversity of antibacterial, antifungal chemicals that we're using in everyday life. Pharmaceutical industry in the UK has grown and developed, and so have lots of other industries which are using a really diverse set of modern chemicals. Those just weren't allowed for in 1989. Now, all that stuff is getting washed down the drains. It's ending up at the sewage works. Also, what's happened since 1989 is that the way in which waste is handled has changed significantly. So that waste sludge gets collected from the sewage treatment works. It gets passed through a number of different brokers and dealers before it then ends up being spread on land. And that process creates a real problem. There's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of detail in the way in which that is processed and handled, and things that are added to it as it goes along its journey. What ultimately ends up as an unknown mass gets spread on our land, where our crops are grown, where wildlife exists, and where that can not just create pollution of the land, soaking into the land, but then that is washed into our rivers, our water systems, and so on. The problem that we have is that all of this is working on a really old, out-of-date regulatory framework, and what we are asking for is simply what the government has already said is required. What is required is an updated testing regime, that sludge is actually brought into the environmental permitting regulations, not the current situation with this sludge regulations, which is that it is being classed as a waste that doesn't need to be permitted. You know, that's basically, it's an excluded waste in the EPRs. And we're saying that's not satisfactory. So really all we're asking for is what the government has already said needs to happen. We're just saying, you must act. You can't kick this into the long grass. This is creating a hazard, multiple hazards, a hazard to the environment, a hazard to wildlife and nature, a hazard to human health. We need to know what's in this waste and we need to act appropriately. If it's inert, if it's within acceptable limits, fine. Land spread away to your heart's content. If it's not, we need to know, and then we need to treat that waste as a hazardous waste, and that needs to be handled in a very different way from a waste which is satisfactory and inert.
It's really clear and it sounds very logical. I'm thinking, I suppose, more broadly about the potential for unintended consequences of what you're asking. And I say that as somebody who spent time working in the water sector and some time around bioresources. So you have to accept that there's some bias, I suppose, in my viewpoint there. I'm not going to hide that. Within the campaign, are you thinking about the consequences of taking the action, raising public consciousness on this topic to start off with, and then what the end game might be or could look like?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it's very complex because, you know, the environment is a mess. It's a messy place, and there's always unintended consequences. I'm an anti-incineration campaigner, but what I mean when I say that is I'm an anti-excessive incineration campaigner, really. You know, waste incineration does have a place in the waste hierarchy, and it may be that we are identifying hazardous materials that ultimately have to be destroyed through incineration. You know, that ultimately that may end up being the destination. I mean, if you look at mainland Europe, their sewage sludge regime means the vast majority of their sewage sludge does end up being disposed of through incineration because they've identified that it contains unacceptable levels of toxins. And so that's the solution that they have come up with. I think as a group, though, what's important for us as Fighting Dirty is that we are acting as a lightning rod, really, where we're identifying that there is a problem with regulation and it needs fixing. We are not claiming to be the experts in the sector, and we're certainly not claiming to be the solution. The solution has to be provided by the experts in that sector. But what we are doing is drawing attention to the fact that the system is not working. We're trying to correct faulty policy and then allow the professionals in that sector, who I trust are aware of this problem and have been trying to do something about it for a long time. I mean, if I think about my work in the construction sector, there are things in there that are just utter travesties and desperately need addressing. And I've been trying to address for decades and simply doesn't get the attention or the regulatory support that it needs in order to change. And so I, as a professional in that sector, am, fuming that nobody's taking it seriously. So I really hope that what we're doing here is giving strength to the arm of those professionals that do have solutions, that do have better ways of working up their sleeves. What they need is this kind of action that will then make their employers and the change makers in that sector sit up, pay attention, and divert resources to implementing those solutions, because I don't believe that anything that we're talking about here can't be fixed. It just needs the right level of attention and resource channeled into it to make change happen. And so we are not even trying to come up with the solution. What we're trying to do is fix the faulty policy and regulation so that those experts in the sector can get on it and start doing what they need to do to improve the situation.
Thank you, Georgia. That's really clear. And it's really helpful to understand where you're coming from, where you draw the boundaries and why you draw the boundaries where you have. And you're right, it is complicated. We're dealing with environmental systems. There's lots of interfaces. There's lots of trade-offs. And when you throw in the current state of the water sector and the wider climate into the mix, it's complicated. And it will be really interesting to see how it pans out. Time, as ever, has flown by, but I've got one final question for you, and I think you know what's coming. I'm going to give you a magic wand, my favourite device on the podcast. Give it a wave and tell me, what do you want to make possible?
It's probably part of what I've already said, that I want people to be better educated and have a mindset that focuses on systems change, because I think we really struggle when we try to just tackle just the little bit that's right in front of our face. These problems that we're facing, they haven't come from nowhere. They've come from a systemic lack of attention to human health and well-being. They've come of a lack of regulation, a lack of understanding and lack of serious budgets given to the bodies that are supposed to be regulating and protecting us. There's whole systems at play here. And I think what I would love is that systems change is something that is included in the curriculum of all environmental professionals' education about, stop just trying to fix that one thing at your company or that one thing, that one small thing. Think about why it's happening and then go for the jugular, go back to the source, because it's like whack-a-mole, isn't it? When you're in industry, there's so many things coming up, but they usually have a common cause, and that cause is the thing that you need to go for. So I would love to see a much greater emphasis on education for systems change, and just that passion for completely changing the way we do things rather than just incremental change. That would be my wish.
Well, I love that. As someone who is a self-confessed systems thinker and a geek about it, I couldn't nod more vigorously. It's tricky, but that is the environment we're working in. It's complex. We need to understand root causes. That's a really wonderful way to finish. So, Georgia, thank you so much for joining us on Planet Possible.
Lovely. Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.
Okay, Paul, so there was a lot there from Georgia, and I'm really keen to get into that with you. Let's start off just by understanding, how are bioresources managed in the UK at the moment? What do we do with them?
At the moment in the UK, the best practical environmental option is for biosolids to be recycled to agriculture land. And so at the moment, about 90% of the bioresources is recycled to agriculture, and the rest is being used for land reclamation, land restoration, and a very small amount, maybe even less than 5%, is being incinerated at the moment. The approach for recovery to land has been governed by some regulations that have been introduced since 1990 or 1989, as sludge use in agriculture regulations, which have been set up over the years to check the potential contaminants in soil sludge, so looking for things like heavy metals and pathogens, and also being mindful of potential nutrient level. But since then, there's also been another round of code of practices and other approaches like the Safe Sludge Matrix, and the Biosolids Assurance Scheme has been set up to provide greater assurance in the quality of the bioresources being applied, and trying to give a little bit more confidence to those involved in the food chain about how the bioresources is applied to the ground.
Right, so I think I'm hearing that the regulations haven't changed since 1989, but there are some other things, a code of practice and an assurance scheme that have been brought in to try and offer some additional reassurance. And those things are looking at things like heavy metals and pathogens. But I guess Georgia was talking about the nature of sludge changing and the concern about things like microplastics and persistent chemicals. So what's CIWEM's role and what's CIWEM's interest in this topic? You talked about a national strategy. Tell us a bit more.
CIWEM and its members are really concerned about trying to get good water and environmental management outcomes. So looking at things like quality of our rivers, promoting a circular economy, having a healthy society and also a resilient nature. And where the water cycle intersects with land management, bioresources is a prime example of that intersection. So we've had an interest in biosolids and wastewater for a number of years. We've had an advisory panel that's been established for a number of years. And within that panel, we've got recognised experts from industry, consultants, academia, and also government talking about what does good look like, advising us on policy and consultation responses, and also just trying to make sure that we're showcasing good practice going forward. And in 2022, Water UK, the trade association for the water companies, asked us to independently look at a long-term bioresources strategy for England, which would take us up to 2050. And underpinning that process has really been collaboration. So we brought together the water industry, the regulators, Ofwat, an Environment Agency, also other stakeholders like National Farmers Union and government, really to try and to understand where we currently are now and where we need to get to. The process looked at regulation, policy, looked at the process of innovation. It also looked at markets and potential acceptability of some of the outputs that could be supplied by bioresources. And that process also developed a route map, if you like, thinking about what could we do with sewage sludge and bioresources, and came up with a number of options. I think there were 4 options. One was around resource recovery or recycling to land. The other one was incineration, and also this role of thermal conversion, which is basically using heat to make the sewage sludge more usable, more stable going forward. And the idea was trying to see how that landscape could reflect and respond to changes in regulation and innovation and interest from the market and potentially consumers in terms of the products that could be recovered.
So were the outputs of that national strategy work that regulation does need to change? Were you thinking about the role of regulation in that space?
I think it's recognising that we need to have greater certainty about what's within the biosolids, bioresources, and that regulation needs to change in terms of managing those risks, but also enabling some of those opportunities for recovery. So trying to turn the whole concept of waste into resource, recognising the need for a circular economy. So regulations definitely has its role. Everybody's waiting to see what a permitting scheme could look like for biosolids, but also what could be done to enable easier recovery of biosolids into other products.
Okay, Paul. So one of the things that Georgia talked about was Europe, didn't she? And she looked to what was happening in Europe and suggested that potentially we were behind the curve in the UK. Is that your experience of the situation?
I think it's quite mixed in terms of what happens in Europe and overseas. Some of them are where we are with regards to struggling to work out the best way forward. So if you look at Spain and France, they primarily recycle their biosolids to agriculture. The Netherlands sends about a third of their biosolids to France, but then incinerates the rest. Places like Denmark and Italy have an approach that's mixed, where they have half goes to agriculture and the rest is incinerated. And Denmark is really quite keen to see what it can do to make the most of biosolids in terms of trying to recover as much as possible, and then it will incinerate. Germany primarily incinerates, and that's thought to be because they've got the infrastructure and it makes sense for them to utilise that. And also the land availability is a challenge with regards to application to agriculture land. Elsewhere, parts of Australia and Scandinavia are starting to think about what could advanced thermal conversion deliver in terms of production of other products, reducing the reliance on recycling to land. And America is really quite patchy. There's parts in America that have banned the application of biosolids to land, but there's other parts of America where they've converted biosolids into pellets and sell 40 different types of variety open to public to use as fertiliser. It's probably not accurate to say most of Europe's incinerating. It is quite patchy across Europe in terms of what they're doing.
So I'm really interested in the unintended consequences of the legal action that Georgia and For Fighting Dirty campaign are taking. And that's because, as I said to Georgia, I used to be a biosolids manager in a previous role, which I really enjoyed doing. I'm really interested in this topic. And so I naturally thought about all the things that make this difficult. There are lots of reasons why we might want to see change as well, but I'm really interested in the unintended consequences. So, Paul, tell me a little bit more about your take on that.
I think we definitely need to do something to, if there are risks in terms of what's in our bioresources, there's definitely something that we need to do to respond to those and manage those. I think the biggest challenge for the industry and the sector is how quickly they can respond. So I talked about the industry being locked into a process where biosolids are being recycled to land. For anything else to be considered in terms of an alternative approach to managing that takes a lot of planning. So the water companies obviously got their business planning cycles, and then there's other planning frameworks. So if there was a need to have different infrastructure, whether that be incineration or other plants to treat the biosolids, that would take at least 5 to 10 years, probably more like 10 years for that to be in place. The sector doesn't deal well with uncertainty, and they want to have low or no regret decisions. And one thing that was apparent when we were doing the Bioresources strategy is there's no one single silver bullet. There's no easy answer. They all have an element of consequences that need to be managed. They also need alignment of regulations, innovation, and market acceptance. So we're not going to stop continuing producing sewage sludge and waste. So what happens during that transition to something that will reduce that level of environmental risk going forward?
Yeah. Do you know, I nearly thought we should call this episode Death, Taxes and Biosolids, because it is an absolute certainty, isn't it, that we're going to keep getting them. So that takes me on to my next question, really, which is, so what needs to happen next? We can see where the Fighting Dirty campaign are headed. They're off to the High Court to explore whether the regulations need to be updated by a certain date. But from your perspective, from CIWEM's perspective, what does good look like next?
I think it's also useful to put this in perspective with what's happening elsewhere in the world. All countries are facing different challenges, and their approach to dealing with this is governed by different drivers and different approaches to land management and different constituents of the sludge that they're managing. One thing that's clear that coming out from all of that they don't get any progress without collaboration and engagement. So we started a process of that in the strategy, and that needs to continue, but there also needs to be some leadership somewhere, whether that comes from government or whether that comes from industry, so we can work out how to get this alignment with regards to risk and opportunity. There's a clear indication from the industry that they want to engage with everyone in that supply chain in terms of potential agriculture, also potential people that will take the sewage sludge and develop products. And I think we need to build on that, as we need an open and rational discussion really about what can be done. I also think there needs to be an element of clear and better communication from the industry about where we are in the process, because in many ways they're not controlling the quality of the sewage sludge they're having to treat. So they're receiving that and trying to do the best that they can within the framework that they have. There's a number of different factors going into play here around the need for a circular economy, the need for self-sufficiency when you're thinking about the cost of artificial fertilizers going up, and the opportunity to use biosolids on land as an alternative. And also there are other opportunities in terms of using biosolids for energy recovery. And we saw a few years ago what dependency and self-sufficiency for energy would mean for the country in terms of prices. So I think we really need to establish a vision on what's acceptable in terms of timescales and process. And that can only really be happening with collaboration. And it's not too late. I think there's opportunities. It's just actually that the timescale to do this will be around a decade or so to actually get good practice going forward to appease some of the concerns out there around environmental and public health risks.
You've started to touch on what good looks like. I'm going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand, as I do to all our guests. Give it a wave. And as our final question, really, what would you like to make possible if you could make anything possible in this space, Paul?
It really does build on some of the things that Georgia mentioned in her interview, particularly around systems thinking. Going back to the discussion in the previous podcast about highways, source control really springs to mind. So it's a bit bonkers, really, when you think about how much effort we put into treating our water, and then we potentially pollute it so much that we can't effectively use that in terms of circular economy. I think we really need to have an approach that values the resources that we have, making the best use of waste in terms of that waste hierarchy. And with that in mind, we need to think about what we dispose of, what we use. And there could be opportunities to think about ways of replacing the amount of microplastics that we have in our waste, also opportunities for reducing persistent organics like PFAS. So in Europe, they're thinking about extended producer responsibility, where the manufacturers or users of those chemicals are made responsible for the potential cleanup of that in terms of cost and the process. So it would be great that we could actually reduce or eliminate those types of chemicals like PFAS and other pharmaceuticals to make sure that it's not a problem that needs to be managed. We all need to go to the loo and we all continue to produce waste, but I'm sure there's certain chemicals that we can live without or find alternatives for that would mean that those potential contaminants don't find their way into the wastewater that we're managing. Again, that's not going to be a quick and easy task. I think to get that systematic change has to go all the way from source to user at the end. And those systematic changes will need everyone to get behind.
It's a great note to finish on, really. Thank you, Paul. And it makes me think that I can understand where this episode began and Georgia talking about the frustration and the inertia sometimes of getting things moving, and why the Fighting Dirty campaign have decided to go down a legal route. And based on the complexity that you've just described, it makes some sense, doesn't it? But at the same time, I absolutely hear what you're saying around the need to have this conversation with all parties and to work together, because it's no one single responsibility to resolve it. So it's a complicated one. I'm really pleased that we got into it, and thank you for joining us. As ever, time has flown by. Another episode is done. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you something to think about in your world, and we've got an amazing season lined up for you, so I hope you continue to join us for those episodes too. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode, and if you get a chance, give us a rating or a review too. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my guest today, Georgia Elliot-Smith from the Fighting Dirty campaign, and of course to Paul Shaffer from CIWEM. That's it for now, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Planet Possible is produced by Bwlb. Bwlb Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.